I had always prided myself on being the kind of man who kept to himself, quietly building a life that was as comfortable as it was self-sufficient. My home, perched on the edge of a sprawling development in the Midwest, wasn't just a residence, it was a fortress of independence. Solar panels crowned my roof like a crown of defiance, the wind turbines in my backyard spun lazily in the breeze, and my little hydroelectric setup harnessed the stream that ran through the northern part of my property. I had invested years of blood, sweat, and tears into creating a private oasis that, ironically, supplied electricity to more homes than I could count. The neighborhood itself was a study in contradictions: pristine lawns, identical houses, and the relentless hum of the HOA, the Homeowners Association, whose members fancied themselves as arbiters of taste, conduct, and control. I'd always kept my distance from them, but when the first official notice arrived in my mailbox, a twinge of irritation passed through me. It was a thinly veiled threat, the kind I'd grown accustomed to seeing from these so-called keepers of civility. Failure to comply with HOA regulations may result in suspension of services, including utilities. The words jumped off the paper, almost mocking me, as if they had any authority over my life. The audacity! They had the nerve to threaten my electricity when, in reality, every wire that carried current through that entire grid, every kilowatt-hour that powered their homes, originated from my equipment. I sat back in my chair, letting the magnitude of that truth sink in. The HOA prided themselves on their power, their petty little committees, their weekend inspections, their relentless letters about shrub heights and fence paint, but they were oblivious to the fact that the very grid they depended on for lights, heat, and air conditioning was born from my labor. And for the first time, I felt a surge of something more potent than annoyance: opportunity. They thought they were in control, but they were playing checkers while I was 3 moves ahead in chess. I began to reflect on the countless interactions I'd endured over the years, the whispered criticisms during meetings, the passive-aggressive notes slipped under my door, the insinuations about how my eccentric energy project supposedly lowered property values. Each insult, each empty threat, each attempt to assert dominance over me had been recorded in the quiet ledger of my mind. And now, faced with the ultimate irony, me supplying the very lifeblood of their homes while they tried to leverage imaginary authority over me, I realized that this was not a mere inconvenience, it was a personal affront that demanded a response as calculated as it was inevitable. I considered the various scenarios in which I could exact some form of poetic justice. There was a certain thrill in imagining their reactions as they tried to enforce their empty threats, only to discover that I held the proverbial plug. I thought about sending a little anonymous note to the HOA board, just a subtle reminder of whose name appeared on the utility permits, whose meters fed their houses, whose energy powered their weekend barbecues. But subtler moves might be wasted on them, they lacked the imagination to appreciate nuance. What they needed was an undeniable demonstration, a spectacle that would shake their sense of authority to its core. In the following weeks, I began quietly enhancing my network. I installed redundant circuits, upgraded my transformers, and synchronized my solar inverters with the main grid. While they continued their petty squabbles over landscaping and mailbox colors, I was preparing a system that could control, within legal limits, the distribution of electricity across the entire subdivision. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about proving a point, about showing that self-reliance carried a kind of power that bureaucracy could never hope to wield. I started documenting everything, from energy production statistics to correspondence with the utility company, building a dossier that would be invaluable if the situation escalated. Meanwhile, I observed the HOA's routines, the times they held meetings, the people most eager to assert authority, the weak links in their chain of intimidation. Knowledge, I reminded myself, was a weapon as effective as any lever or circuit breaker. I smiled when I imagined the faces of the board members when they realized that the person they thought they could threaten, the person they assumed would meekly comply, had not only anticipated their moves but had quietly orchestrated a network of influence that extended far beyond their comprehension. Even as I meticulously planned my strategy, I maintained the outward appearance of the compliant homeowner. I attended HOA meetings sporadically, nodded politely at their suggestions, and feigned concern over community aesthetics, all the while masking the storm of preparation raging behind closed doors. It was almost too easy. They had underestimated me, writing me off as the solitary eccentric who played with solar panels and turbines. I let them underestimate me. Every smirk, every dismissive glance, every underhanded comment was absorbed and converted into fuel for the inevitable confrontation. And the beauty of it was that I didn't need to provoke them openly. They would stumble over their own arrogance, and I would simply guide the outcome with a steady hand, unseen but omnipresent. I reveled in the irony. The HOA's obsession with control, their petty demands and threats, would ultimately be their undoing, all because they had failed to recognize the true source of power behind their homes. The day finally arrived when the tension reached its apex. A formal letter from the HOA, hand-delivered by their self-appointed enforcement officer, landed on my doorstep. It read, in florid bureaucratic language, that they were prepared to suspend my utility should I fail to comply with certain infractions that, to any reasonable observer, were laughably trivial. I read the letter twice, then 3 times, savoring each phrase as if it were a fine wine. My response, however, would not be written on paper. It would be written in the flickering lights of their own homes, in the hum of their refrigerators, in the illumination of their living rooms, where the glow of electricity came from my systems alone. And as I stared out the window at the houses in the distance, each one unknowingly tethered to the power I provided, I felt a sense of satisfaction that was almost sacred. The HOA had issued a threat, confident in their imagined dominion. But I, the man they sought to control, had quietly assumed the role of the architect of their comfort, and the stage was set for a revelation that would leave them questioning every assumption they had ever made about authority, power, and the consequences of underestimating the quiet man on the edge of the development. The days that followed were a study in patience, observation, and calculated maneuvering. I knew better than to act rashly. After all, the HOA thrived on impulsive reactions, misinterpreting every gesture as either submission or defiance. I bided my time, enhancing my systems while simultaneously letting them operate under the illusion that nothing had changed. From my vantage point on the veranda, I watched the comings and goings of the board members as if I were studying a chessboard full of predictable pieces. There was Milton, the self-important president who prided himself on his mastery of forms and bylaws, Janice, whose obsession with the color of front doors made her practically immune to logic, and Harold, the former electrician turned HOA enforcer, whose misplaced confidence in his limited technical knowledge made him the perfect unwitting adversary in my unfolding plan. Every morning, I documented the flicker of their attitudes, noting who complained about whose landscaping, who left notes in mailboxes with passive-aggressive precision, and who strutted around with the overinflated sense of power that comes from controlling trivialities. This information was essential. A battle is only won when one knows the enemy intimately, and I was nothing if not methodical. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the first hints of twilight illuminated my property, I worked on integrating my power systems into a network that would allow me to modulate electricity subtly across the entire grid. It wasn't about cutting power immediately, it was about creating leverage, the kind of leverage that grows more potent with each passing day of ignorance on the part of those who think they hold the upper hand. I experimented with load balancing, adjusting supply lines so that I could redirect energy to essential areas while throttling power to non-essential circuits, lights, air conditioning, entertainment systems, without ever tripping alarms or alerting the utility company. The elegance of it all lay in subtlety. The HOA would feel powerless, confused, and frustrated while the reality remained entirely in my control. I documented every adjustment, recording voltage fluctuations, timing, and response patterns. Every detail mattered, every minor observation could be exploited in the right moment. To them, electricity was a utility taken for granted. To me, it had become a weapon of precision, capable of delivering discomfort and enlightenment simultaneously. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their campaigns of intimidation. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, warning of immediate action and potential fines. Milton's signatures adorned every page, scrawled in an almost desperate attempt to assert authority. Janice posted passive-aggressive notices on community bulletin boards, and Harold occasionally rang my doorbell to lecture me on compliance, each time leaving with a slightly furrowed brow that betrayed his growing unease. They were relentless in their pursuit of imagined control, blind to the fact that the very foundation of their houses, quite literally, depended on my infrastructure. I allowed these interactions to continue, recording audio, taking notes, and carefully cataloging each instance of their misguided enforcement. Each attempt at intimidation was a gift, a reminder of their arrogance and a building block for the narrative I was quietly constructing, one that would culminate in an unmistakable revelation of power and consequence. During this time, I also began reaching out, discreetly, to some of the more unsuspecting neighbors. I offered advice on energy conservation, tips on solar optimization, and suggestions for minor electrical upgrades. Nothing overt, nothing that would suggest I held sway over the main grid, only enough to plant the seed that someone out there understood energy in a way the HOA never could. Conversations were casual, friendly, almost mundane, yet they subtly reinforced the idea that I was knowledgeable, capable, and indispensable. I could see the small shifts in perception over time, the nods of respect, the subtle acknowledgments when a board member misinformed a neighbor and I corrected them gently but authoritatively. The social groundwork was as important as the technical groundwork. Power isn't only about wires and circuits, it's about perception, influence, and timing. The more they overreached, the more my position solidified. And as the weeks passed, the anticipation built to a nearly tangible tension. I could feel it in the air, in the way board members glanced nervously at their thermostats, in the subtle complaints about flickering lights that coincided perfectly with my minor load adjustments. I never tripped the line, never caused outright failure, yet I allowed the discomfort of unpredictability to gnaw at them. It was psychological warfare as much as technical mastery. I savored the irony, imagining Milton pacing his living room, swearing that the problem lay somewhere in my non-compliant house, while I lounged in my study, sipping coffee and reviewing graphs that proved every fluctuation originated with my controlled adjustments. Each day reinforced my strategy. They were arrogant, ignorant, and entirely dependent, while I remained calm, competent, and in full command. Their threats, once menacing, now provided me with the very stage on which I would ultimately reveal the truth, that the power they so arrogantly assumed they could cut was a gift they could not live without, and the one man they had tried to dominate held the key to their comfort, their convenience, and their very modern lives. When the moment to act finally arrived, it wasn't announced with fanfare or bravado. It slid in on a Tuesday afternoon like a quiet tide reshaping the shore. I had decided against theatrics, no dramatic blackout, no public spectacle that would allow them to play the victim and rally the neighbors against me. Instead, I delivered a lesson in controlled consequence, the sort of correction that leaves people bewildered long after their lights come back on. I began with Harold. He was the easiest to manipulate because of his ego and his habit of poking where he didn't belong. One late afternoon, as he tinkered with a faulty porch light complaint 2 houses down, I timed a subtle dip in the non-essential circuits that powered his television and outdoor accent lighting. The change was seamless to the grid and to any cursory diagnostic a homeowner might run, but Harold felt it immediately. The television's backlight dimmed, his smart thermostat hiccuped, and an expensive set of LED landscape lights blinked twice and resumed. He grunted, cursed under his breath in that way men do when pride is pricked, and marched home convinced the problem lay with faulty wiring or, worse, his own ignorance. I let him stew. Over the next week, I nudged at different nodes, Janice's neighborhood block during her beloved evening garden parties, Milton's cul-de-sac while he hosted a boisterous board meeting at his house. I throttled the ambient comforts they took for granted, the hum of an air conditioner that kept a sunroom tolerable, the soft glow that made a porch look welcoming, the chilled whisper of a refrigerator. Never an outright failure, never a hazard, never a single appliance destroyed, only the kind of precise discomfort that breeds anxiety and finger-pointing. The HOA's complaints grew louder, their memos more frantic. They called the utility line, they hired a licensed inspector, and they convened emergency meetings in which each accusation ricocheted back and forth like loose nails in a shaken box. I listened to recordings of those meetings later and smiled at how quickly the blame circulated outward, never inward, until Milton, with all his confidence, suggested a neighborhood-wide audit that, he insisted, would prove the problem wasn't systemic. He was confident in paper and posture. He lacked the imagination to suspect the quiet man who landscaped the edge of the development. But manipulation alone would not suffice. I wanted them to understand the calculus of power, to feel the discomfort I had felt when they threatened my rights with the same arrogance they used to enforce paint colors. So I began a second, subtler campaign, education by example. I started leaving simple, anonymous notes on certain doors, handwritten, courteous, containing small, useful facts about energy use, how a small thermostat change could alter peak load, why LED drivers occasionally flicker under fluctuating voltage, or how a neighbor's poorly timed pool pump could cascade load spikes. The notes were never accusatory, never identifying me, just the kind of small wisdom that makes people think, and think they arrived at the idea themselves. Conversations ignited in doorways and over hedges. People compared notes about their flickering lights and shared one of the anonymous tips. I watched as the narrative shifted from, someone is messing with us, to, maybe there are things we don't know. Once the seed of doubt was planted, it spread faster than any official bulletin ever could. Then I escalated the clarity of my message. One early morning, before Milton had his coffee, I arranged a discreet meet with a handful of neighbors who had shown curiosity rather than reflexive suspicion. I didn't reveal the plan, I simply offered them a demonstration, an hour of uninterrupted, enhanced comfort sourced from optimized distribution. I tweaked circuits so their refrigerators hummed perfectly, their lights glowed steady, and thermostats held steady temperatures despite a heat wave. It was subtle, but the difference was palpable. Over iced coffee on a neighbor's patio, they described the night before, no flicker, no humming, no weird thermostat behavior. The word spread organically, no grandstanding, just gratitude. When one neighbor murmured, with a tilt of head toward the HOA office, that someone must know what they're doing, I felt the satisfaction of a lesson learned. They were beginning to see that the problem had nothing to do with a malevolent force and everything to do with knowledge and stewardship. But stewardship cuts both ways. While I offered help to those willing to listen, I hardened my stance against the board's aggression. I compiled every letter, every note, and every encounter into a legal folder, copies for my attorney, copies for the utility, and copies tucked behind a ledger I labeled plainly, evidence. My actions were careful to avoid illegality. I never damaged equipment, I never endangered anyone, and I documented each subtle modulation in case questions arose. The strength of my position came from transparency as much as capability. Were the HOA to escalate into threats or revenge that crossed legal bounds, I wanted the paper trail to reveal motive and pattern. Still, legalities aside, it was the social humiliation I relished most, the slow, inevitable reconfiguration of their self-importance into questions and humility. I expected denials, angry meetings, and frantic PR from the board. What I didn't expect was the fissure that opened between board members themselves. Milton demanded answers and fingered paperwork as if a signature could summon the truth. Janice, who had once led the crusade against my eccentric panels, softened when neighbors began asking practical questions about energy savings rather than insisting on conformity. Harold, who had once been so eager to show me the right way to screw in a light bulb, started showing up at community gatherings with an odd, apologetic conservatism. Their cohesion, their vaunted moral clarity, frayed under the strain of uncertainty. The community split into factions of curiosity and suspicion, but neither group could fabricate the technical competence that quietly hummed in the background, competence I controlled. Each faction's conversation threaded back to me in quiet ways, a compliment overheard at the grocery store, a question asked politely at a barbecue, a neighbor pausing to look at my turbines with a new, respectful curiosity. And then, like a conductor easing an orchestra into a grander movement, I pulled one more lever. At the next HOA meeting, after weeks of subtle engineering and social shifting, I sent an email, not to the board, but to the entire community, carefully worded, devoid of accusation, offering a voluntary workshop on household energy resilience. It read like neighborly advice: if anyone is interested in learning how to reduce flicker, lower bills, and prepare for outages, please join me this Sunday. No boasts, no threats, only the invitation. The reaction was immediate. Some called it a trap, others shrugged and marked the date on their calendars. But a meaningful number, enough to draw curious minds from across the development, accepted. On that Sunday, under the generous shade of my maple tree, with charts printed and appliances demonstrated, I taught them simple things: how small changes reduce peak strain, how redundant circuits improve resilience, how community awareness trumps bureaucratic threats. I demonstrated with measured pride, answering questions without condescension. When a hand raised in the back, Milton's hand, trembling slightly with the weight of his ego, I explained a concept about distributed generation and community dependence. He listened. He wasn't pleased, but he listened. By the time the meeting ended, the balance had shifted not through a dramatic single event but through an accumulation of small, undeniable truths. The HOA's authority became less about edicts and more about cooperation, and in that transformation, they had no one to blame but themselves. Their attempt to wield power without understanding the system had opened the door to learning they had arrogantly dismissed. As neighbors filed out, chatting about new thermostatic strategies and simplified meter readings, a few of them patted my shoulder with genuine thanks. The petty tyrants of the board were left with their memos and their memos alone, while the people they governed had begun to think for themselves. The revelation was not instantaneous revenge so much as a long, educative correction. Power used thoughtfully invites respect, power wielded ignorantly invites its own undoing. I watched them from the back of the meeting, comfortable in the knowledge that I had taught a lesson without burning bridges, yet I also knew that should they ever attempt to weaponize the law or their own authority again, I had both the technical means and the documented record to make sure their arrogance cost them more than mere embarrassment. When the tide finally turned toward its fullest crest, it did so not as a single blow but as a cascade of consequences that left the HOA scrambling to patch the gaping holes their own arrogance had opened. It began, predictably, with paperwork. Threats escalated into formal notices, and formal notices escalated into the kind of bluster that reads well in a newsletter but poorly in a courtroom. Milton, empowered by the language of bylaws and the applause of like-minded overseers, announced at a board meeting that they would pursue a literal shutoff if what they called non-compliance continued. He spoke with the lovely certainty of a man who had never held an electrical diagram in his hands, as if signatures and stern letters could substitute for competence. The board voted nearly unanimously to instruct their chosen enforcement officer to contact the utility and demand action. They drafted letters, stamped them with the HOA seal, and intended to present a united front. The irony that the very grid those letters relied upon hummed because of my turbines and panels was, of course, lost on them. They saw only black ink on white paper and the comforting illusion that rules equaled control. Their escalation forced my hand in ways that were both unavoidable and, frankly, satisfying. I had planned for contingencies. I had legal counsel on retainer and a neat stack of production logs and correspondence with dates, times, and meter readings. But beyond documentation, I wanted to convert their humiliation into a kind of corrective clarity, for them and for anyone who might be tempted to confuse privilege with authority. So I scheduled a meeting with the utility company, inviting a representative to my property under the guise of a routine maintenance check. I was, privately, amused by how quickly they accepted. Utilities, after all, are trained to avoid triangular disputes. They like things straightforward: customer, provider, invoice. What I presented them that morning, my synchronized inverters, redundant transformers, and the clean, verifiable telemetry streaming from my systems, was not just evidence of my capability but a demonstration of a better way to supply energy: local, resilient, and community-minded. The technician who came with the utility rep ran his hand along a conduit, squinted at an oscilloscope, and said a word I like to hear in such moments: efficient. We spoke plainly about liability, about how an HOA-mandated shutoff could look on paper but, in practice, would require coordination, legal, technical, and expensive. I watched the expression on the utility rep's face shift from bureaucratic disinterest to professional caution. He asked for copies of my logs and promised to escalate my dossier to his supervisors. That small administrative nudge, gentle and perfectly procedural, would later become the nail in the board's overblown coffin. Milton's letter to the utility arrived as planned. His signature looked as practiced as ever. The utility's response arrived a week later, measured and surprisingly formal. They explained, in careful language, that any action to disrupt service would require court orders or a demonstrated violation of codes that I had not committed. More importantly, their engineers had flagged the community's dependency on my distributed generation as a complicating factor. In plain English, cutting power was not a simple lever they could pull without endangering equipment, creating liability, and, quite possibly, triggering outages for a much larger set of customers than the HOA imagined. The board, who had imagined themselves as puppeteers, found themselves suddenly entangled in bureaucracy far more complex than their memos. The very institution they had thought would back their bluster instead demanded evidence, due process, and, in practice, a better understanding of what "shut off" actually entailed. The glorious part of it was that their attempt to weaponize a municipal service revealed them as novices in a realm where novices do not get to make unilateral decisions. Meanwhile, word of their grand plan leaked. Of course it did. I am nothing if not careful, but I am also human and occasionally enjoy the theater of an audience discovering the script. The neighborhood buzzed in a way that had nothing to do with buzzers. At grocery stores, at school pickups, over coffee, the topic was not the HOA's righteous indignation but the unsettling idea that the lights might go out because of pettiness. People called each other, compared notes, and began to question the moral calculus behind a threatened shutoff. Those I had quietly helped over the months, neighbors who had learned how to reduce peak loads and who had seen their own appliances behave more predictably, did not want to be party to a punitive action that could, in an instant, affect the elderly, the ill, or families with small children. Sympathy shifted, as sympathy often does, to pragmatic concern. Conversations turned from "who's right?" to "what safeguards do we need?" and "how can we protect vulnerable residents?" The board, which had planned a dramatic enforcement, now faced the lumbering, immovable force of community care. Their moral position, once sculpted in polished language and confident posture, thinned under the honest light of consequence. At this juncture, I made a choice that moved the narrative from private amusement to public responsibility. I could have used my leverage to browbeat the board, cut their comforts until they resigned in shame, and some part of me relished that fantasy. But the man I had become over those months, the man who took pride in stewardship and slow, instructive victory, chose differently. I convened a town hall-style meeting in the community center, not to accuse but to explain. I had prepared visuals, graphs showing load curves, simple diagrams comparing centralized versus distributed generation, and cost-benefit analyses demonstrating how a properly managed microgrid could save money and increase resilience for everyone. I explained, plainly and without flourish, how their petty threats had endangered the community by inviting knee-jerk action that the utility properly refused to take. I talked about legalities, about liability, and, most critically, about ethics, you cannot threaten people's basic needs on a whim. I made no accusations, I gave facts. I offered proposals, a voluntary cooperative to manage distributed resources, a neighborhood fund for backup systems for the elderly, and a transparent council that would include technically literate residents. The room, which could have been a hostile chorus, filled with people asking pragmatic questions. Milton squirmed, but he could not stand against public reason. Janice looked chastened as elderly neighbors spoke about medical equipment and the risk of an outage as if such risks were new to them. Harold, whose chest had swelled with performative authority for so long, quietly asked a technical question about surge protection. He no longer sounded like an executioner, he sounded like a man suddenly awake. The aftermath of that meeting unspooled in ways small and large. The HOA's board was forced, by sheer practical pressure and by the utilities' insistence on formal procedure, to step back from their threats. They rescinded the shut-off motions with awkward apologies that did little to hide the fact that they had been outmaneuvered by complexity they had refused to understand. In the weeks that followed, membership in the cooperative I proposed, initially a modest pilot, grew. Neighbors signed on not out of gratitude to me personally but out of the shared realization that community resilience required competence and cooperation. The cooperative contracted with the utility to formalize interconnections and with licensed electricians to verify safety standards. The angry memos in the HOA's file cabinet remained, but their sting was blunted by the practical reality of a neighborhood that had learned to take care of itself and to demand reasonable, evidence-based governance. Still, hubris leaves marks. Milton found his authority diminished, people no longer looked to him as the final word. Janice, who had once delighted in enforcing conformity, started attending my informal workshops, asking questions about energy use with an earnestness that surprised her critics and soothed some of the friction she had caused. Harold, who had used technical jargon as a shield, eventually approached me to learn for real, no bluster, just curiosity. The board didn't dissolve overnight, institutions rarely do. But the culture shifted. Respect gravitated toward competence and away from posture. The HOA, chastened and a little humbler, began proposing community improvements that were informed by the cooperative's data rather than by a checklist of arbitrary rules. Slowly, grudgingly, they learned that authority is most legitimate when it is accountable, knowledgeable, and aware of the consequences of wielding power without understanding. Personally, the episode taught me something I had not expected, that the best vindication is not revenge but responsibility. I had built systems out of necessity and a stubborn streak of independence, but when those systems affected other people, I realized stewardship was the moral axis I preferred to turn around. I kept my edge, of course I did, but I used it to catalyze a community to do better rather than to crush those who had tried to crush me. When the sun set on the neighborhood and the lights came on across a dozen houses, steady and reliable, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with balance restored. The HOA's threats had been an affront, confronting them had been necessary. But the endgame, what mattered most, was not to humiliate for sport but to make sure that the people who live next door are safer, more informed, and more empowered than they were before. In that, I found a kind of victory that does not fade with the passing of memos or the resignation of a board member. It endures in thermostats set sensibly, in neighbors who know how to flip a breaker safely, in a cooperative fund that can pay for a backup generator for the frail, and in the quiet knowledge that power, literal and metaphorical, should be wielded with care. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood began to hum with a new rhythm, one I had orchestrated quietly, without fanfare, but with precision that even the most obstinate HOA board could not ignore. Their attempts to assert dominance had dissipated into the background, replaced by conversations about efficiency, preparedness, and mutual responsibility. I walked through the streets with a calm sense of purpose, acknowledging neighbors with a nod or a brief word, knowing that every home I passed was part of a network I had nurtured into resilience. Milton's authority, once a formidable wall, now resembled a decorative fence, present, but easily stepped around by anyone willing to think practically rather than dogmatically. Janice had become an unlikely advocate for energy awareness, approaching me with questions I was happy to answer, her demeanor softened by the humility that comes from being confronted with one's own limits. Harold, perhaps the most important transformation of all, had stopped attempting to police behavior he barely understood and instead began attending my informal workshops, learning earnestly rather than performing the role of technical enforcer. The HOA still existed, of course, its bylaws still posted on polished letterhead, but its teeth had been blunted by knowledge, accountability, and a community that had quietly discovered the limits of intimidation. I took particular satisfaction in the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the neighborhood's social fabric. Where once petty rivalries and minor grievances festered under the heavy hand of the board, now practical cooperation and technical awareness shaped conversations and decisions. The cooperative I had initiated continued to grow, attracting not only curious neighbors but also pragmatic voices who recognized that self-reliance, paired with shared knowledge, created security stronger than any edict or fine. Even those who had initially resisted my quiet influence began to respect it as a stabilizing force, recognizing that power does not reside in the ability to threaten or coerce, but in the capacity to ensure continuity, safety, and well-being for everyone involved. I remained somewhat in the shadows, a presence known but not domineering, allowing the neighborhood to see that influence rooted in expertise and foresight is more durable than control imposed by arrogance. The greatest lesson, I realized, was in the subtlety of control. I had chosen not to cut their lights abruptly, not to disrupt their comfort violently, because the true measure of power lies not in spectacle but in quiet mastery. By letting them experience small, controlled discomforts, and then offering knowledge, assistance, and tangible solutions, I transformed what could have been a conflict into a demonstration of stewardship and competence. The neighborhood began to see electricity, energy, and shared resources not as abstract commodities but as responsibilities that demanded understanding and respect. And the irony, that those who had attempted to threaten me were dependent upon the very systems I maintained, remained quietly, satisfyingly in place, like a watermark on the reality of the community. Each flickering light that once caused panic became a reminder of the lessons learned, a living proof that oversight without insight is an invitation for correction. There were moments, of course, when I reflected on the entire episode with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. I had been the target of overbearing authority, faced threats, endured scrutiny, and watched as the board sought to impose control over someone they believed could be intimidated. Yet, in every calculated action, from subtle circuit adjustments to public demonstrations of competence, I had maintained the high ground, never compromising legality or ethics, while simultaneously demonstrating the consequences of ignorance and overreach. The HOA members who had once thought themselves untouchable were now quietly aware of the limits of their influence, and the community had acquired practical skills that would benefit them long after my immediate involvement. I had reshaped not only their understanding of power but also their conception of what it means to wield responsibility, and in doing so, I had created an enduring, functional legacy that extended far beyond petty threats or individual grudges. In the end, life returned to a sense of calm equilibrium. My turbine spun in the breeze, my solar panels soaked in sunlight, and the small hydroelectric stream continued its quiet labor without recognition, powering homes across the development with dependable energy. I continued my routines, tending to the land, fine-tuning systems, and observing, always observing, because vigilance is the companion of competence. The HOA had learned that authority without understanding is hollow, that threats against those who possess the means of control can backfire spectacularly, and that influence built on knowledge, foresight, and patience endures far longer than intimidation ever could. And I, the man they had tried to dominate, remained quietly sovereign, not through aggression, but through preparedness, insight, and the unshakable knowledge that true power often resides in the hands of the one who builds rather than destroys. In a world where the petty wield authority over trivialities, the patient, competent, and quietly observant achieve victory not by confrontation, but by shaping reality itself to reveal the folly of arrogance, one perfectly timed flicker of light at a time.